The coronavirus may still be surging in some states, but the Trump administration is still pushing for schools to reopen this fall. Skyler Henry has the latest from the White House.
President Trump signed executive orders aimed at cutting drug prices.
Under my administration, we're standing up to the lobbyists and special interests and fighting back against a rigged system.
This week, the U.S. surpassed 4 million coronavirus cases, but the administration is still pushing for schools to reopen this fall, even though the president recently said some hard-hit areas may have to delay for a few weeks.
It is our firm belief that our schools are essential places of business, if you will, that our teachers are essential personnel.
The CDC has released updated guidance for reopening schools, emphasizing in-person instruction with social distancing and the use of face masks. Vice President Mike Pence brought the administration's push to reopen to his home state of Indiana.
Opening up our schools again is the best thing for our kids. It's also the best thing for working families.
White House negotiators and congressional Republicans say they want to include more than $100 billion in funding to get kids back to the classroom in a Phase 4 relief bill. But party infighting has delayed the release of their proposals till next week.
A house is burning down in terms of the economic security of America's families, and these people are fiddling wherever they may be this weekend.
Democrats are pushing for an extension to the $600 enhanced unemployment benefits that are set to expire for millions of Americans over the next few days. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin says Republicans want to extend unemployment benefits to cover 70% of lost wages.
And Skyler Henry joins us now. Skyler, great to have you with us. The president announced on Thursday that he was canceling the Florida portion of the RNC due to the pandemic. Now the CDC has new guidelines which essentially push for schools to reopen, though those guidelines are intended to help them do so more safely. How is the White House explaining what to some seems like a contradiction?
Well, the administration is essentially saying, Lana, that this is a matter of essential employees getting back to work. When you take into consideration that teachers are essential, according to Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany, to getting back to school. They also have been pushing for students to get back in school as opposed to this virtual learning that some of them have had to do over the last few months as schools had to shut down because of the pandemic. Now, initially, we started to see a lot of school districts already say that they are going to start at least virtual learning for the first few months of the school year and then perhaps revisit the idea of having schools or kids get back into the schools. But now we're starting to see this push not only from the Trump administration but from the CDC as well that are starting to kind of lean into the idea of having an emphasis on having kids in the classroom. Now we've heard from Dr. Debbie Birx as well who's pushed for this. We've heard from Dr. Fauci who's pushed for this as well, but they are also a little bit concerned about the idea of having that transmission of perhaps a COVID case in a school district and what that could mean for a school. So we have heard conflicting information as far as the likelihood of a child spreading the coronavirus up until this point. The CDC says that that is not as likely the case. Dr. Debbie Birx says that there's not enough information that suggests that that is the case or that is not the case, that kids wouldn't necessarily transmit the coronavirus. But I think what we're starting to see from the CDC are recommended guidelines, particularly the things that we've heard of, washing your hands, social distancing, wearing your face masks, and taking other appropriate measures to make sure that kids, staff, and teachers are as safe as possible when they are inside of the classroom.
Well, Skyler, I want to follow up with you about the CDC guidelines. We know that the president was displeased with the first set of guidelines that were issued about schools reopening. How much of an influence, if any, did he have on these updated guidelines? Do you know?
Well, if he didn't come out and say it, it certainly seems as though the CDC is following the president. I mean, just a month ago, the CDC had much harsher guidelines when it came to reopening schools. We heard from everybody from the president and Vice President Mike Pence, who said that we should not necessarily follow the CDC's recommendations when it comes to reopening schools. But now the tone seems to have shifted a little bit to where the CDC is saying that we do want kids back in the classroom. But here's the thing, though. Even though there's this push to get these kids back in school, they're also wanting to make sure that schools and school districts pay attention to what's going on in terms of the surrounding cities and surrounding area in terms of spikes in COVID cases. For example, in like a Georgia or a Florida or a Texas or in Arizona, where are these spike in cases or so, like there needs to be a little bit more attention to what's happening in respective cities, as opposed to, say, another area that doesn't have nearly as many cases to say that their kids can actually get back into school. So it's a matter of waiting and seeing. But in terms of if the president actually leaned onto the CDC to make sure that this is actually the narrative that's going to be pushed now, that isn't so clear.
All right, Skyler, what's the latest on the negotiations between the White House and lawmakers for phase 4 of the coronavirus relief efforts?
Well, to use a basketball analogy, the shot clock is certainly winding down here in terms of wanting to get this Phase 4 bill passed. I mean, the lawmakers on Capitol Hill have already said that they wanted to see something done by the end of the month, but that remains to be seen. We heard from some of the Democratic leadership, particularly Speaker Pelosi, speak out against this earlier today, saying that she and other Democrats feel as though Republicans aren't prepared. They haven't given them a bill on paper that they can actually review and debate and actually work on in terms of bringing this to the American people so that they can work on having some sort of a stimulus for not only American workers, but for American businesses as well. And you have to worry about things like this. These unemployment checks are going to run out within the next few days. You also are starting to see a lot of people start to worry about whether they can afford their rent. We'll probably see the eviction numbers start to go up as well. And so as these numbers start to rise here, you have to wonder what lawmakers are doing. Speaker Pelosi addressed that in her remarks earlier today. She said that she wonders where everybody is going to be this weekend. I mean, we're days away from this catastrophe, in her words, coming to the forefront here, and still Republicans have not put anything together. Now, we do know this, that they are in favor of adding some sort of unemployment benefit, but not nearly the amount that was in these last phase of the bill. Maybe about 70% or so is what they're looking to have in this bill. And so there are measures that we've heard of, but we just haven't seen anything on paper. So when everything kind of gets onto the floor and gets to the president's desk, that remains to be seen.
I know a lot of people are waiting anxiously to see what happens with that. All right, Skyler, I want to pivot to China. On Friday, China ordered the U.S. to close its consulate in Chengdu. It comes after the United States did the same to the Chinese consulate here in Houston. Remind us what recent measures contributed to this escalation in tensions, and is this a loss for the United States?
Well, yeah, I mean, this speaks to the deterioration between the two superpowers that have gone on for months now when it comes to everything from trade to intellectual property, technology, everything like that. It all seems to have been affected over the last few months. I mean, just recently, the president put sanctions on China for the treatment of the people in Hong Kong. And so we're starting to just see more and more of this. Now, it isn't necessarily clear as to why the administration has chosen to shut down the consulate in Houston, but what's going on in Chengdu is essentially a response to that. Now, we did hear from the Chinese Foreign Ministry that said that they were not happy with the current climate between the U.S. and Chinese relations, but they are going to do what they need to do. We did hear from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo yesterday, who essentially said that for the last 50 years, Americans have not reaped the benefits of the relationship between the U.S. and China. In the last 50 years, that's Richard Nixon. He was the first president to go to China. But in that time, he says that the Chinese have participated in unfair business practices and have taken advantage of American jobs and things like that. And so when you start to think about what this shutting down the consulate in Chengdu means, that actually means several things. For one, we now lose that relationship with Washington and Beijing, and that, communication fissures a little bit. And then we also don't necessarily know what's happening in China altogether. So as, this continues to progress and we start to see this relationship either break down or try to repair at some point, the communication is starting to get further and fewer between in terms of how easily it is for the diplomats here in D.C. to be able to have conversations with people over in China.
All right, Skyler Henry at the White House. Thank you.
Thanks, Lana.